why don't I go ahead and introduce our speaker today, who is Dr. David Turner. So Dr. Turner obtained his undergraduate degree from an institution that is near and dear to my heart, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He then went to Baylor for medical school and pediatric residency, where he also served as chief resident. He then did a pediatric critical care medicine fellowship at Boston Children's. Following fellowship, he put his Tar Heel loyalties aside and joined our institution just down the road, Duke University, where he served as both section chief of pediatric intensive care and associate director of the Duke GME program. But just about a year ago, Dr. Turner joined the American Board of Pediatrics, where he serves as the vice president of Competency-Based Medical Education. And he will be speaking to us today on that topic and on Entrustable Professional Activities. So with no further ado, let me turn it over to Dr. Turner.
Thanks, Chuck. Thanks for that very kind introduction. Yes, I'm happily still a Tar Heel, despite the fact that I did spend a few years working at Duke over the last several years. And I appreciate the opportunity to spend some time with all of you as a pediatric intensivist and a former pediatric critical care program director. I certainly have fondness and appreciation for all of you as both my pulmonary colleagues and as program directors of subspecialty fellowship training. So I have about 30 minutes of PowerPoint presentation that I'm going to go through, and then hopefully we'll have plenty of time for discussion, conversation, and questions about these two topics. As Chuck mentioned, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about CBME and Entrustable Professional Activities. And just as a broad outline, the three main topics we're going to cover are general principles of CBME. I'm going to talk a little bit about the ABP's Entrustable Professional Activity Framework, and then talk about where we're going with EPAs, both generally and as it relates to pulmonology as a specialty. And I'm going to start sort of from the beginning because I know there are varying degrees of understanding and expertise and familiarity with both the principles of CBME and EPAs. So I'll try to provide a little bit of background to get everybody on the same page as it relates to the terms and the things we're talking about, and then go a little bit more into future directions and some of the practical elements. And so to start, entrustable professional activities and why is competency-based medical education important in terms of where we're going. The first bullet is really the most important one on this slide, in that CBME focuses on the desired outcomes for the patient as the initial goal, and then works backwards from there. So the educational goals and priorities are designed to align with the patient outcomes that we're trying to achieve. And then the natural consequence of that is a learner-centered and flexible approach that can lead to much more individualization and flexibility in the approach to education. When we talk about CBME, many people immediately jump to the fourth bullet, right, which is this idea of variability of time and flexibility there. And that is a potential natural consequence of a robust approach to competency-based education, but it's really not the primary goal. I think the first goal has to be competence and achievement of competence, and having trainees who are graduating and meeting the expectations that we want them to achieve. And then once we have a system in place where we feel like that is working well, thinking about how to be more flexible as it relates to time and some of these other issues then becomes a part of the discussion. Because at the end of the day, what we're really trying to do is maintain the important obligation that we all have to the public to graduate, and in the case of the board, certify qualified pediatricians and subspecialists. And so this, for those of you that had a chance to look at the article that was circulated, this figure is from that paper. And it really just provides a snapshot at a high level of what we're thinking about when we talk about CBME. If you go from left to right on the slide and you make the transition from medical school through residency, and in your case through fellowship, formal learning decreases, and it decreases to a certain level but doesn't go away. And it's this idea of creating a framework that sets us up for lifelong learning within the specialty that we really want to establish in a robust way. And that's where we're trying to go with the EPAs and with CBME in general. And one of the challenges that we currently have, and my guess is this will look very familiar to all of you as program directors, is that our current approach to assessment in graduate medical education is primarily based on competencies and milestones. And I think competencies and milestones are quite valuable for educational development, and they're important tools, but they're really not designed to stand alone for assessment. Sort of like the circles scattered on this slide, competencies focus on isolated behaviors of individuals, but when you're delivering care in the clinical environment, that requires integration of a variety of those tasks and skills. And the context that is missing from the milestones sometimes create challenges for assessment. And we certainly have heard from program directors and frontline faculty that they struggle a little bit with strictly milestone-based assessments because they have trouble with the context that's missing as it relates to the clinical environment and the picture that they're trying to create for a learner as they're going through. And so what EPAs do is EPAs take those circles and bring them together into a meaningful care delivery bundle. And so what an entrustable professional activity is, for those of you that this term is new, is really an observable activity that describes something that a pediatrician or a subspecialist needs to do that a patient needs. And I'm going to go through the pulmonary specific EPAs in just a minute. And it's really important to remember that what EPAs do is they provide a context, as I mentioned a minute ago, and then they integrate a variety of competencies and milestones into a bundle of care delivery that faculty at the front line who are doing assessments and program directors all generally find very intuitive when you think about how you work with a learner. And in terms of our overall framework that we've developed at the ABP, so we now have entrustable professional activities in all of our subspecialties and in general pediatrics. And so there are 17 Gen Peds EPAs. There are 5 that span the continuum from general pediatrics through the subspecialties, which I'll show you in just a few minutes. There are a couple that are designated just for the subspecialties, and then each sub has between 3 and 6, depending on whether that subspecialty community falls into the lumper versus the splitter category when they built their EPAs. And we'll talk about the pulmonary ones on the next slide. And so these are the 5 pulmonary specific EPAs. And we're not going to go through these in a lot of detail, but it is important to note that if you look at them and take the first one as an example, which I'm going to show again in a couple of slides in more detail, it represents a very broad activity. So EPA 1, for example, is acute complex respiratory disease in multiple settings: ambulatory, emergency, inpatient. This is obviously a very sort of broad and holistic activity that's designed to meet the needs of the patient. And it also is designed with the end in mind. So there obviously are a number of different elements and components that could inform this EPA. For example, managing the patient with cystic fibrosis in the outpatient setting, managing a patient who has an acute exacerbation in the emergency room. And you could think about how different faculty members and different members of the team could assess this EPA or parts of this EPA in different settings that then would inform a larger decision about entrustment made by you as a program director in conjunction with your CCCs. And we'll talk a little bit more about that process as we go along. But these were the 5 EPAs that the pediatric pulmonary subspecialty community developed in conjunction with the ABP several years ago. And we also are in the process of developing a mechanism so that we have a way to regularly evaluate and assess the EPAs to make sure that they remain relevant and are addressing the issues that are important for practice of pediatric pulmonology. And in addition to these core pulmonary EPAs, there are 7 EPAs, which I mentioned a minute ago, that are common to all the subspecialties. Several of these are non-clinical activities like leading within the profession, scholarly activity, although there are a couple of clinical activities that are included here like handovers and consultation, which are clearly important clinical activities for all subspecialists, regardless of what specialty they're in. And in thinking a little bit more about the EPA and what the parts of it are, so this is just a snapshot from the website of the first EPA that I mentioned a few minutes ago. And I included this here mostly to show the supervision scale. And so as you can see on the slide, the scale ranges from observe only, which is many people say, most of our fellows don't start at this level for any EPAs. Although if you look at the current data, which we'll be publishing soon across all of our subspecialties, there are many more level ones in the first 6 months of training than I was expecting there were going to be. So there are trainees that start at the observation only level, and then it progresses through various levels of supervision so that ultimately you're getting to the point where the trainee can execute an activity without supervision. And if you think about how your faculty interact with fellows in the clinical environment, when a faculty member is in clinic with a fellow, it's a pretty easy decision for them most of the time to know whether or not they need to be in the room with the fellow when they're taking the history, when they're doing the exam, or whether the fellow can manage the patient on their own based on various criteria, whether they be complexity of the case or otherwise, and then talk to the faculty member after the fact. So the mechanism of deciding entrustment in a frontline way for these types of assessments are very intuitive and pretty straightforward for faculty members. And then you can take a multitude of those assessments that happen at the bedside as a CCC to make a larger decision about entrustment for the activity. And for each of these activities, there are a number of functions that are outlined for each activity, and we're not going to go through all of these in detail. You can see this EPA has 4 specific functions. And then what we've done to try to help the community further with implementation is taken each of the functions and exploded them out into a variety of other tasks and skills that are important to achieve that function. And you can see some of the curricular components for function 1 are listed here. And these can be used for building of curriculum, building assessment tools, helping guide learners to give them some very concrete examples of things they need to do to progress to the next level of entrustment. But they have a variety of ways they can be used. But one of the things we want to be sure we reinforce is that when you look at a document like this and go through all the curricular components that are important for a given EPA's function and then for a larger EPA, this was certainly not designed to be a checklist, right? So the idea isn't that you are able to, in detail, go through each one of these points in each one of these bullets and check the box and say, okay, if each one of these boxes is checked one time, then that means I'm ready to entrust this fellow. This is really designed to be a resource. And all of you who work with fellows regularly and have spent time doing this for varying numbers of years know that there are specific things that you observe a fellow doing and you learn about them. And then this was described yesterday in a call that I was on by someone else, where you had this sort of aha moment where you realize that, I know what they're going to be able to do with the next patient they see based on these observations that I've seen. And that may involve 3 or 4 of these elements, and it may involve more or less depending on the learner and the clinical circumstances. And the flexibility that is available with EPAs is really an important part of that. So one of the things to keep in mind is when you think about the curricular components and the resources that we provide to help implement EPAs, it certainly is not designed to be a number of boxes that you have to check to achieve an entrustable professional activity. And then in addition, we've already mapped each of the EPAs to a number of the milestones and competencies. And so what that does is allows for assessment of an EPA, which is a larger holistic activity that a patient needs and that a fellow needs to achieve. And then by doing that, you're automatically assessing a number of different competencies, and you can, there's a pretty easy way to create that relationship, which I'll touch on a little bit more towards the end of the talk. So going back to the analogy from earlier, you have the milestones that are sort of scattered around and don't really have the clinical context that's necessary. The EPAs bring them together into a clinical package so that then ultimately you have an example like this, where there's an EPA that's being assessed. And as a part of that assessment, you have information about a variety of different milestones, which are listed on the right side of the slide. And all of that sort of feeds into the ultimate question that we're trying to answer, which is the learner ready to be trusted to perform this activity without supervision? Because that, when you think about this from the perspective of the program director, and what you're trying to achieve is to get your fellows ready to be unsupervised so they can progress towards graduation. Through the lens that we use at the ABP, we're looking at this based on our obligation to the public to make sure that we're certifying pediatric pulmonologists that are equipped to practice in the specialty without supervision at the standards that the public needs. And, one question that often comes up is, why do we need to make this transition? So why is it necessary? Is there something wrong with the system that we're using now? And the data would support that there are some substantial gaps in our current approach to graduate medical education at all levels. So this is a slide from a paper we published last year that Dan Schumacher and colleagues from a study that they did looking at a large number of residents across a wide range of residency programs. And on the left side of the slide are the 17 general pediatrics EPAs. And the right column are the percentage of graduating residents who were ready for unsupervised practice at the time of graduation based on their program director and CCC assessment. And so as you can see, none of these numbers are 100%, and some of them are quite low. So if you look at the Behavioral Mental Health EPA, a little more than half of residents who are finishing residency were ready for unsupervised practice at the time of graduation. And there are several other EPAs at which the number is less than 80%. So this represents not only a deficiency at the individual level, in that there are individuals who need, additional support to be able to get to the point where they can be entrusted for an EPA, but also a programmatic issue, right? Because this is something that on a global scale really has been identified and needs to be addressed to help trainees move along the path towards reaching unsupervised practice in these areas. In the subspecialties, so this is a survey that we did that hopefully some of you participated in, and we published earlier this year, that asks subspecialty program directors across all of the subspecialties. So there were over 600 respondents to this survey across all of the subs. And the question was, what level of supervision would you require for graduation for the common subspecialty EPAs that I mentioned earlier? So the 7 EPAs are listed across the bottom. And as we talked about, several of those are non-clinical activities. And the y-axis in this figure is the minimum level of supervision chosen by program directors as the level they would require for graduation. Just of note, the percentages at the top of each bar represent the number of percentage of program directors who would allow for a lower level. So for example, for quality improvement, the minimum level of supervision chosen by the vast majority of program directors for graduation was a level 2, but 4% would have said that would have been a level 1. And if you remember back to the scale I showed earlier, below the line is an expectation of direct supervision. Now, there's some debate. We could have a debate about whether in areas like quality improvement, scholarship, leading within the profession, whether level 2 is the appropriate level at the time of graduation or not. Clearly, there is a need for ongoing support in these areas for junior faculty. And I think we all recognize the learning curve that exists there and the importance of mentorship early in the faculty years in these areas. But even in the clinical activities like consultation and handovers, there are a pretty significant number of program directors that would allow graduation at a level 3, with the vast majority of them choosing level 4. And I think that is an interesting finding and something to think about as we think about not only what does this look like for graduate medical education and graduation from fellowship, but then what does the next phase of this look like as we think about the early stage of continuing certification after graduation. And one of the things we're very interested in is smoothing out that transition so that it becomes less of an abrupt change from fellow today, faculty tomorrow, so that there are mechanisms for support and a structure that's created to allow for the continued learning that we know is necessary as an early faculty member. And all of this got brightly tossed into the spotlight over the course of the last year or so, 2 years almost now. I don't have to go into a lot of detail about the number of disruptions that all of you had as program directors in your programs with your fellows in terms of their clinical experiences and in a variety of other ways. But you may recall from early in the pandemic, there were med schools that were letting people out early. There was a lot of call for flexibility in training and how we approach various issues as it relates to training requirements from the CBME and certification requirements from the ABP. And one of the things that was missing was a really sort of robust approach to being able to say, which of our learners are ready to complete training and we're completely comfortable with that. And more importantly, which ones still need more time and what deficiencies do they need to fix. And that's the type of system that we really want to work on putting in place over the course of the next several years so that we can do that well. And then as we have other issues that arise that would necessitate flexibility, whether that be a massive pandemic like we've been dealing with over the last couple of years, or other things that are just a part of life and fellowship, like leave of absence and other things, it would allow for a much more flexible approach than we are able to do at the current moment based on the systems that are in place. And, just to reiterate some of the points that have come up along the way over the last few minutes in the talk, EPAs are important because they focus on activities that the patients need. And one of the other things that's really valuable is that they allow us to address emerging topics and changes, challenges that exist that we need to address. A good example of that is as we looked at our EPA framework through the lens of the events of the past year, one of the things we realized that there was a gap in addressing both racism and disparities as a part of the EPA framework. So we modified the Population Health and Quality Improvement EPA in conjunction with a number of experts in the community that was reviewed very broadly, so that now the Quality Improvement Population Health EPA specifically focuses on addressing racism and better addressing inequities in care that we know is a problem. And the EPAs allow for this flexibility, particularly when there is a mechanism in place for regular review and update of them to make sure that they stay relevant and applicable to current practice. So that ultimately what we're trying to do is increase accountability across the entire continuum, which then leads to the consequence of the last bullet, which is increased flexibility, which I think there is always interest in, certainly among both trainees and the program director community. And so a few last few slides about where we're going and the plan for the next few years. So I touched on this idea of regularly updating the EPAs so that they align with our other assessments at the board. So most of you have probably noticed that as the content outlines have been revised over the last few years, the content outlines have become much more general and don't have the sort of level of detail that many program directors appreciate that they use to drive curricular planning and other activities. What we hope to achieve is alignment so that the EPAs and the curricular components of the EPAs really serve as that resource that the more detailed content outline used to be, and then the EPAs, the content outline for the initial certification exam, the MOCA-PEDS objectives, all of the assessments that we do at the board will be aligned in a way that is consistent as we think about the overall snapshot of assessment as it relates to certification in a subspecialty. And then we plan to transition so that we're using EPAs and decisions around EPAs as a prerequisite for certification starting in 2028, which is far enough down the road that it seems like a long way off. But it will be here before we know it. And to that end, we want to make sure we're collaborating with all of you in sessions like this and having discussions about what you need and what tools are going to be necessary to help do this successfully as we move down the path towards broader EPA implementation. And one of the things that is very important that we want to make sure we're addressing as a part of that is this connection between the EPAs and the milestones. Right? One of the things we want to make sure we avoid is this feeling of EPAs being one more thing that's getting added to the list of things that program directors have to do. Certainly, I remember as a program director, and when I was a program director, there were many fewer administrative requirements than there are now. There is a significant administrative burden to being a program director, and we don't want the EPAs to become a part of that. And that's one of the reasons we want to figure out a way to help programs use the EPAs and the milestones in a synchronous way without it being an additive process in terms of work. And so to that end, one of the things we will be able to do very soon, based on the data from the SPIN study that's going on now, which has a number of programs across all the subspecialties, and they're assessing both milestones and EPAs, there's clearly a very easily reproducible mathematical relationship between milestone ratings and EPA supervision ratings. So if you were in a situation where you wanted to say, I'm going to focus on EPAs, use an EPA framework for assessment, you could put those numbers into a file, and then the suggested milestone ratings based on the supervision scale that you choose would come back out at you so that it would happen in a very automated way. And what that does is allows for you to, when you want to use exclusively EPAs and trainees are progressing as they should, that becomes a fairly straightforward process. But if you have a fellow who's not meeting standards or not progressing as you would expect, then you can look at those milestones in more detail and figure out, okay, what are the skills and tasks and competencies that we need to work on and address to make sure this trainee moves up to standard and gets to the next level of progressive supervision as an entrustment rating. And so that's a way where the EPAs and the milestones can work together without necessarily adding to the list of things to do for a program director, so that you don't have the situation where you have to individually assess every EPA and every milestone separately, because they are very closely related to one another. And that is data that we'll be publishing soon. And then our plan is to broadly share the formulas that go with this, so that as we make the transition towards an EPA-based framework for assessment, it makes the assessment of milestones much easier. And we're continuing to have discussions with the ACGME about the relationship between EPAs and milestones and where we're going. And the hope is that happens in a collaborative way over the coming years. And I'm really pretty optimistic about that based on the conversations that I've had with them over the last several months. And so a couple of practical considerations as we come to a close and then can open up for discussion. As I mentioned earlier, the EPAs are very flexible. There are no specific rules, nor will there be, about how to inform entrustment for each EPA. I think that multi-source evaluation from a variety of raters in a variety of settings is really critical. But it is important to remember that the curricular components are not designed to be a checklist, and you can use these to make broader assessments of a number of different milestones at the same time. And the other point that is really quite important is, while the supervision rating is an important endpoint, right? The idea of getting to unsupervised practice is what we're trying to achieve, and what all of you are trying to achieve as program directors, but how you get to that decision is really critical. I think most faculty and CCCs find an EPA-based approach to assessment pretty intuitive, so that's a great start. The longitudinal relationships that exist, particularly in fellowship programs, are quite helpful, although, as is the case with any form of assessment, you have to be aware of bias and how that plays into that, the potential assessments, and we'll be paying attention to that over the coming years, both from a research point of view and from an implementation perspective, as we think about ways to mitigate unwanted bias as a part of the assessment process. And then thinking about what your overall program of assessment looks like for your individual program is something that I'm interested in learning more and thinking about with all of you, and then what resources that you might need to do this well. And that'll be one of the subjects that hopefully we can talk about over the course of the next few minutes. And so just to close, I'm not going to go through the 5 core components of the CBME framework that are listed here, but I do want to touch on this idea of programmatic assessment, which is point number 5. And the idea here, and this is going to be familiar to many of you because this is similar to what you do as a part of your own processes, but thinking about, what does the overall program look like in terms of how we assess our learners? Where does the data come from? And how do we make decisions is really an important priority. And this gets back to the issue of, yes, the supervision rating that is ultimately made is important, but how you get to that in terms of using these elements is really key. And, most of you, I am sure, have an approach that has multiple data points coming from multiple types of people with a variety of methods. Workplace observation is always a challenge. Although certainly in the fellowship arena, there's a lot of close contact between fellows and faculty on a regular basis, which really helps with that third point here. And then thinking about, personalized, timely, and meaningful feedback is really key to this process, so that there's a growth mindset involved in thinking about, why is a learner able to do some activity and what can we do to help them move to the next level. I think that in many circumstances happens quite well. I'm sure if you ask your fellows if they need more feedback, the answer is always going to be yes, although usually they're looking for feedback that's positive as opposed to criticism or constructive criticism. But that's really, all joking aside, a key part of this process is creating a growth mindset so that both the faculty and the fellows are engaged in the process of progression so that ultimately they can move down the path towards being entrusted. And then that helps the CCCs as they get more information and make these decisions about overall entrustment. And so, the way we look at this for the future is really a continuum. So if you think about, along the bottom of the slide, this idea of moving, through the path of entrustment to becoming a master in a specialty begins in the training environment, but certainly does not end there. I think that has to continue through both initial and continuing certification. And we're spending a lot of time thinking about, what are the standards going to be for graduation? What's that going to look like? And then how are we going to navigate the structure that needs to be put in place for initial and continuing certification to support not only learners, but newly minted subspecialists in thinking about how they close gaps that we know exist in the current process now. Because if you think about, every fellow that graduates from one of your programs is not created equally, and some have strengths in one area and areas in others that they need to continue to work on. And if we could create a structure that allowed that continued lifelong learning to start right away and smooth out the transitions that occur, then I think we could really define success in the future. And that's what we're trying to achieve. And so I will end there. And these are the two questions that I was hoping to spend a little bit of time talking about with all of you, in addition to whatever other questions you want to cover. But one of the things I'm really interested in is, what can we do from the perspective of the board or the program director community at large to help set up a robust program for assessment within your programs? And then what tools will you need to facilitate successful implementation of EPAs? So there's two things that we're very interested in, because we not only do we want to be involved in setting the standards, right? So setting a high standard with EPAs that the goal is to achieve those as a part of training and then into practice, but we also want to support helping programs figure out how to get to meeting the standards as we think about what it means to be certified in pediatric pulmonology. And I'll stop there and I'll stop sharing so I can see everyone and see if anyone has questions.
Great, thank you.
Chuck, are you going to navigate the hands, or do you want me to call on people?
If you can, either way, if you can see them.
Yep, I can, I think. Looks like, I don't know the order, but we'll do Jennifer, then Panina.
Hi, Dr. Turner. Thank you for that. That was very informative. I have a question about, so thinking about when you were a program director trying to sift through the hundreds of applications you probably got to try and discern applicants from one another and really just get a good idea of their performance as a resident. We collect a lot of information that may or may not be useful. And the executive committee has flirted with the idea of coming up with a method to help us discern their performance as a resident without judging them and using their evaluations as, for us to judge them as an applicant, because, obviously we don't want to do that. And I know their milestones become available to us after they match. But what would you recommend? What kind of method, whether it's a form or a standardized template letter or other method to really get at the information that programmatic assessment is intended to do? Because, our letters of recommendation are like stellar, all of that has been shown not to really make that much difference. We're even getting medical student performance evaluations, which many do not find useful. What do you recommend that we do to modify the way we collect information for
that's an excellent question. And it's also a question that there is a lot of interest in the subspecialty community at large. I had a discussion with another group recently about this same topic. And I know there is at least a little bit of traction in APPD at the residency program level, in thinking about this idea of a warm handoff of some form between residency programs and fellowship programs. as you noted, I think the timing of that is quite important, right? And so whether that's happening as a part of the application process pre-match or post-match when they're going to be your fellow, I think the approach to that would be very different depending on which timing you're talking about. But if you're thinking about, once they've matched and once they're going to be yours, and I'm not going to dive into the how do you select them, because the selection process is also in and of itself a whole nother discussion. But the idea of having a templated approach to information transfer from a residency program to a fellowship program would be a great start in setting up this idea of a growth mindset that we're really focused on helping you develop as a learner. I think the only way that can really be successful is if the learner is a part of it in some way. Because I think if it's just a program director to program director communication, you have a lot of potential worries there. How's it going to be perceived by the trainee? If they're not a part of the discussion, if depending on the relationship they have with their residency program director, and then, the unknown relationship that you have with a new program director and a subspecialty, there's just a lot of nuance and complexity there. But if you could come up with a templated way to have a conversation about, in a genuine way about the things that one, is doing well and needs to work on as that transition is happening from, one time point to the next, there's potentially a lot of value there. And whether that uses, an EPA framework, there probably are some general pediatrics EPAs that you could use as a part of some of the templating in that discussion. There also was the recent work that was done by COPS, where each of the specialties was outlining the things that a general pediatrician or general pediatrics resident should know that relates to their specialty. Using that as a part of the template also potentially could be valuable. And so I think those are some of my sort of high level thoughts about that. If you're thinking about the time point between, after the match in the transition. Now, I think the gathering of data to make a decision about a resident is a more complicated process that I don't know I have any easy solutions to, at least at this point. I know there are some people doing some work in that area, and I think, thinking about it with a group of people in the room, many of whom are smarter than me, most of whom are probably smarter than me, is probably a good idea.
Got it. Thank you.
Thanks. Panina, then Brenda.
Thanks, David. And I can't imagine a room of people smarter than you. So, but thank you so much. I mean, in terms of EPAs, I just think that they're so more intuitive for what we do every day. So, so much more related to the decisions we made. But I had a general, big overview picture from the ABP, and that so by 2028, EPAs will be a prerequisite for certification. So what does that actually mean? Is that like a summative assessment at the end that, or is that tracking milestones tracking supervision levels every 6 months? And if you can describe a little bit, just bird's eye view of what decisions get made and how you'll use the data up to that point to make decisions.
Yep, that's a great question. For full disclosure, that's still a little bit of a work in progress. But I think in general, there's going to have to be a standard that we choose, right? Which, based on the data, is probably going to be for the clinical EPAs, an entrustment rating of 4 as opposed to 5, right? Because I think most trainees, when they're finishing, are still going to need some level of support. And they're going to talk to faculty about complex cases as a junior faculty, and that's what they do. So we'll have to set a standard, and there will have to be a summative decision that is made at the program level. I think we, from the board's point of view, are not interested in getting into the business of guiding the decision at the program level. I think, as has always been the case, this is going to be a program director and a CCC decision that is made. But I think once we've decided on the standard and a summative decision is made based on EPAs, the additional question that we're going to continue to have to work on is, what does the next phase of this look like? Knowing that there needs to be more structure in place for the new graduate in thinking about transitions. And we've had a number of discussions with our continuing certification team about what that looks like and what the future of certification may be. I think if you think about 5 to 7 years from now, what we do, as it relates to certification in general, very much has the potential to evolve. If you think about the way things are going and have been going over the last few years with standardized exams and other approaches to that. And I think movement towards EPAs and a patient and learner focused approach is really one step in a larger direction in thinking about where we're going as it relates to certification. But we will be likely collecting EPA data at the conclusion of training that will then be used in a formative way as the next phase of life once you've gone from graduation to being, in this case, a pulmonologist. I think the tricky part there, right, is that there has to be a standard, right? There has to be some standard that has to be met to complete training, and how you approach those that aren't ready and need more time, honestly, is not a new problem, right? Because there are people like that now, and I certainly recognize all the various pressures that exist on program directors from a variety of directions in terms of having people finish, on time and in sequence. But I think thinking about sort of what the standard is and making sure that that's clear, so that then we can work with all of you to think about how do we make sure we're helping trainees achieve that standard as they transition into the initial phase of certification, that then we can address the structure there. Does that make sense?
Thanks. Yes, totally. Thank you, David.
I think I lost one of the hands, Louise, but I thought there was another one up.
Yeah, I initially had Brenda there, but I'm a middle name person, so I changed it to Louise.
Oh, okay, great, okay.
Thanks. I appreciate what Panina said about that the Entrustable Professional Acts are very intuitive, and I completely agree with that. Just as a bit of a background, I'm actually Royal College trained in Canada. So I've been dealing with the format of the milestones called CanMeds for my entire career, because that came out back in the 80s. And I know that we did a lot of Entrustable Professional Acts, and I've actually integrated them into my program here. However, I'm wondering, is this a move to go towards more competency-based training rather than time-based? Most programs, if not all in Canada right now, have gone to competency-based training using solely CanMeds and EPAs to get them through.
I think that's potentially where we're going to end up, but I try very hard not to frame that as the primary goal, because I think in order to have a time variable approach to graduate medical education, you first have to have the competency part of it. And I think if we implement EPAs well and we achieve what we're trying to achieve over the course of the next several years, the natural next discussion will be, okay, what do we do about duration of training? Because time does then become a variable. I think in the US system, in comparison to Canada, there are a number of additional complexities that get added into that. But there certainly are some ways you can think about transitions in a creative way that don't necessarily involve the chaos that often sort of immediately enters into certainly chairs' minds when we start talking about time variable training. You don't necessarily have to envision a world where fellows are starting and completing your programs all across the year and there's really no cycle, right? So this idea of promotion in place and other approaches that have been taken that allow for a transition to the next level, whatever that next level happens to be, without physically leaving an institution or transitioning out of a program, is a compromise that sort of gets us down the path towards a genuine competency-based approach that's time variable without necessarily having to entirely fix the US system of graduate medical education. Deb?
Sorry, I made it on. For those of you that saw my panicked emails, I thought maybe because I'm not a program director, people weren't allowing me to join the Zoom, but I made it despite your best efforts.
I tried to exclude you, but you made it.
Yeah, it was a good try. It was a good try, but I figured it out. I think one of the questions that you had asked was what tools would be helpful. And I would go out there to say, and I'd be curious if others agree with me, honestly, as much actual help developing assessment forms, I think we're all doing this, or we're all program directors because we like education, but as you said yourself, it's really hard. There's a lot of administrative stuff. And I think most of the things that overwhelm program directors are like, oh my God, a new assessment thing. Now I got to develop, assessment forms. And I think helping us, one of the things that was great about our EPA work with the board was how you and Carol at the time really channeled us all to work together within our specialty to develop the EPAs. We did them, but with a lot of help and guidance from Carol and the rest of the board. And I think, if there are ways that you all could help us do that same process for maybe developing some new evaluation systems, I personally think that could be really helpful. Some of us on this call have developed, great local things that we use and that we could also share and work together. But I'd be curious if others agree with me, but that's what I think, coming up with those better assessment tools that you're talking about to help, whether it's the EPAs, the milestones, both of them, others, that's what I think would be a great help.
I don't know.
I
if
also
others
add that, interfaces with software, whether it's Epic or new innovations. I'm not familiar with that one, but to actually be able to plug algorithms in there, I think would be really very helpful.
Yep. So that is certainly consistent with things we've heard from other specialties as well. I actually just did a webinar, I think it was last week, for the MedHub community, for those of you that use MedHub. And they have a number of capabilities in their system that allow for integration of EPAs, connection of EPAs to milestones. My sense from talking to New Innovations is that they have a similar ability to do that. And so certainly from the perspective of the board, we are very interested and willing to collaborate and think about ways to do some of the things that you just mentioned, Deb. I think one thing that we often hear from program directors, particularly those that are relatively new to EPAs, is just figuring out where to start. Like if you take that first EPA as an example, that is more or less like 75% of what it means to be a clinical pediatric pulmonologist, right? The acute management in the inpatient emergency room and outpatient setting. And so thinking about how to break that into meaningful pieces that can then be used for quick assessment tools by faculty in a real-time way that also are, fellows are engaged in, is a relatively straightforward process and can be done in a very flexible way based on the types of patients that you see, the types of clinical environments that your fellows work in. And I think we are very interested in helping with that work. I think one of the drawbacks of it sort of coming from the board as opposed to the program director community in conjunction with the board is that we definitely don't want those kind of resources to be seen as a mandate, right? So if we come up with a way to break apart EPA 1 and include several different components, I wouldn't want program directors to feel like, oh my gosh, this is exactly the way I have to do it because the board said I did, right? Because I think there's a lot of flexibility there. And if we can come up with a way to work together with all of you to develop that core, set of resources and tools to both assess and teach using the EPAs as a framework, we are definitely interested in helping with that work. And we've heard that from other subspecialties as well. Can you get us to not have to write? Thank you. Yes, I appreciate that, Deb. That is a topic of ongoing discussion, and I am not closing that door yet. So we're keeping our fingers crossed for the transition to EPAs without having to report to the ACGME. That's something that we will continue to discuss. And I think the more we're able to connect the two in a meaningful way, the better off we are. And I think that there certainly are a variety of ways each can be used and can be used together. And I think from our point of view, doing that in a meaningful way that's valuable for program directors as opposed to an obligatory way, whether it's EPAs or milestones, is really what we're trying to achieve. Because what we really want to do is raise the bar as it relates to both education and assessment. And I think there are ways we can do that using the combination of the EPAs and the milestones. Other questions or other thoughts about specific tools that you would find helpful? One of the things we have heard a few times from other specialties is faculty development materials. I think we have heard, similar to what Penina said earlier, and I think Louise reinforced, is the idea that EPAs are pretty intuitive and relatively straightforward for most faculty. So I think the development in terms of how to use them is easier than with some other things, but I think there still is some faculty development required, and we certainly are more than willing to help those. There's a video that we created recently. It's a 4-minute animated clip that outlines what an EPA is, that can be used for faculty and learners and in other settings. And those are the types of things that we have heard would be valuable for programs. And so if anyone has specific ideas, either as a part of this or in follow-up, don't hesitate to let us know what kinds of things you would find valuable. Oh, thanks, Brenda. I think Brenda put the video link in the chat, which you can use and distribute broadly if you find it valuable.
If I can make a comment, it's Louise again. I think it would be really helpful for us program directors to share what we find works really well, especially the evaluation part of an EPA, because I think that's where it's sort of becomes, I find it intuitive, like, oh no, I had to do everything on my own, or versus like, I didn't even have to be there. They're so competent at what they're doing, but how that looks, and we can share resources to make it easier for everybody. There's, as far as I'm concerned, there's no reason what to share what we're building in our own programs and sharing and not reinventing the wheel.
I see Liz call, and we are building resources for that on the PEPTDA website as well.
And that's one of the things I've been most impressed by the program director community over the years, even from back when I was a program director, is the willingness to share. It's just creating a mechanism to do that easily, I think, is often the challenge within a specific subspecialty. And if there are ways we, from the board's perspective, can help facilitate that, we're definitely open to ideas and discussion about ways we can support that work.
That's a great segue into, I know we're coming up on the hour, but I'm sure you have a lot of very interested parties on this webinar, but what's the best way for folks who want to be part of this process to get involved?
The easiest place to start is to just email us. Either me or Brenda can put the CBME email in the chat. And we will also be reaching out over the course of the coming months to years to the program director community, both in the subspecialties and in general pediatrics, as we think about the toolkit, what this looks like, how to build assessment tools, how to build curriculum based on EPAs and all those things. So we will be reaching out and asking for volunteers along the way. But in the meantime, if you have a particular interest or if you have ideas, you can email the CBME box that was just put in the chat or email me directly. I'm super easy to find, and I'm always happy to hear from program directors about this topic.
And very responsive, I will add, when we reached out to you. So thank you.
Thank you. And we're also happy to come to either the PEPTDA group as a whole, or if within your programs there are ways we can help support that work or have conversations, we're always happy to do that as well.
Can I ask a super fast question, David, about your Chuck? Is that okay? You're the timekeeper.
I'm never going to tell Penina no. So,
no. But my impression, but please, David, tell me your impression, is that in terms of developing tools of assessment, like I remember 3 milestones, Carol kept saying, you don't need to build your assessment tools based on milestones. It seems even with EPAs that the assessment tools should be based on direct observation per se, and excellent feedback, and that there doesn't necessarily have to be an assessment tool that is EPA based. I feel like we're actually very good in CCCs at making the determination, and certainly the data has shown without specific EPA based tools. And so I'm curious as to your vision about that.
Yeah, I think it does not have to exclusively be EPA based and specific. I think the most important point is that the CCC and program director have multiple sources of information, as much data as possible to make an entrustment decision. And it also doesn't have to be complicated. So for the first EPA, you coming back to that one as an example that we talked about earlier, you could come up with easily, 100 tiny sort of micro questions that you could ask your faculty that they would immediately know the answer to about most of your fellows based on their experience just in the last couple of weeks. And that's the kind of information that CCCs need that can then, be used to make a decision. And whether that's a question that is specifically sort of designed based on the EPA, or it's a general question about their clinical activity, or, an other form of direct observation of something that they're doing. I think all of those different data points are really an important part of the process. And one of the things that we're, going to be working on coming up with as we think about the toolkit are some guiding principles along the lines of what you just mentioned, and thinking about, what are the sources of data, what should they look like, just to give programs who have questions or new programs or others a framework for what this should look like as they're, building their assessment program and getting data for their CCCs to make decisions about EPAs. But you're absolutely right; they don't have to be all modified and specific, to be focused on exactly the language of the EPAs. That's one of the benefits of the flexibility of the framework.
Anyone else have any other questions or comments? If not, I will again express my appreciation for Dr. Turner sharing an hour plus of his time with us this afternoon. And we will definitely keep everyone up to date on anything we hear from ABP regarding the integration of the EPAs.
Thank you.
Thanks, David.
Thanks again for having me. It was really great to see all of you, and don't hesitate to reach out if there are any other questions or anything you need. And thanks for all that you do.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, David.